And welcome to the inaugural episode of the Critical Strike podcast. I am Will Cladley of the YouTube Game Escape channel. And what a week, actually what a month, I should say, to start a podcast. Tons of hardware rumors and hardware releases, and this will be an episode focused on hardware of various sorts, and I guess the first big story is the release of the Oculus Rift. Now, the Oculus Rift came out about a week and a half ago, and it really, to me, and I think to a lot of people, is the start of the VR revolution, if it is indeed a revolution. So, I wanted to talk about the marketing of VR and some of the positives and negatives I see with this new hardware coming out. Obviously, we also have the HTC Vive. I'll start off by, just talking about my decision about whether or not to jump on board. And ultimately, I said that I would not jump on board, at least not right away. Now, I will say that I am building a gaming PC, and I'm building it with VR in mind. I want it to be VR ready, but I just find myself at this point in my life and kind of looking at a lot of the other products that I've sort of purchased as an early adopter within the first 6 months of release, and I'm not sure that the video game hardware industry in particular, and to a larger extent, the consumer electronics industry, has really earned our early adopter money. And I say that having had, if you follow my YouTube channel, you'll see that I had a really bad experience with the PlayStation 3. The PlayStation 4 actually survived the Xbox 360 disaster. I didn't get that quite on release. I've built computers that have had shoddy motherboards. I was affected by the Sandy Bridge situation with one of the first, Sandy Bridge motherboards that came out. So, not to mention cell phones and tablets. After you buy them, a year or two down the road, they're just not working the way they worked on day one. You seem to lose functionality as time goes on. So with an absolutely brand new technology, I'm not sure that this is worth jumping in on. I'll give you another example. I bought an OLED TV when they were released. Now, I haven't had any problems with that, but there are sort of slight screen uniformity issues. The UI is slow. And I would imagine that once the next wave of OLED comes out, it'll be a significantly better product for slightly less money. Now, of course, that is the reality of consumer electronics in general, but I'm not sure that, I want to put the money into building this gaming PC and then having to, pony up the, I guess, $600 for the Oculus, $800, I believe, for the Vive on top of that. I think another contributing issue to my decision-making anyway is that the games themselves do not look that appealing. I looked at the Oculus lineup, and these launch titles, while I think superficially interesting, there's that sort of Wipeout F-Zero type game. They're not giving me a compelling reason to play. I think there's a robot shooter as well. For $300, maybe you can say, well, yeah, okay, let me give these a shot. But at $600, $800, I'm just not sure that for me it's worth it. And then, of course, I was reading about that Oculus has had some problems. The pre-orders have not shipped out. A lot of people are saying that the Xbox 360 or the Xbox One controller, I should say, is not an ideal input method. A lot of people are waiting on those I don't know what you would call them, those hand controllers that are coming out later in the year. There's one bug, apparently, that I just read about this morning that I think is pretty significant, and that is apparently you have to install all Oculus games, and of course the Oculus software itself, to your C drive. And that might not seem terrible at first, but, if you consider that, for a lot of people, including myself, you have a moderately sized SSD boot drive, and certainly the computer I have now was purchased at a time when those drives are expensive, so I've only got a 200 gigabyte drive, and that fills up pretty quickly, so I supposedly they're working to address that. All in all, I'm not sure if, it is just a wise purchase at this point. Now, I haven't heard a ton of stuff about the Vive. Other than that, it seems to exceed the performance of the Rift in several key areas, such as brightness, field of vision, and of course, I believe that it has some sort of, room recognition technology that allows you to kind of move around a little bit better, in the space of your room. Now, of course, this brings us to the question of PlayStation VR. And PlayStation VR was introduced also a couple of weeks ago. They're taking pre-orders. And when you compare it spec for spec to the Oculus Rift and the Vive, you wonder exactly what PlayStation is going for. You have the external processing unit. You're dealing with a PlayStation system that struggles to produce 1080p 60 frame per second gaming in just sort of standard releases, and they've come out and admitted that, in their opinion, the PlayStation VR is not going to be as robust as its competitors. Of course, it is significantly less. I think it's $400 plus. You've got to get the PlayStation camera, or whatever they call it, for the PlayStation 4, so that's probably another $50. So, while it's cheaper, it certainly isn't cheap, and the lack of hardware prowess that, the PlayStation 4 has when you compare it with PCs and stuff like that, I don't know how you can jump onto that. Either certainly have more of a wait-and-see approach. Now, to put the criticism aside, I'm not saying that I think VR is going to be a fad. I think this is a very, very promising technology. And, I say that obviously because if you grew up in the 80s, there was that sort of faint promise of virtual reality from early attempts, through to the Virtual Boy, the idea of the holodeck in Star Trek. It seemed to be the direction in which you would want to take gaming. Obviously, now we have the technology to realize it. I think from my perspective, I would need a very compelling software set to get me involved. Now, what do I mean by that? I think I would jump in, for example, if we had something like a Bethesda game, if we had a Fallout, if we hadn't had an RPG that would, and I've always thought the Fallout or the Elder Scrolls games would be the ideal type of a game because they're immersive experiences as they are, and to just put that, helmet on and sort of just dissolve yourself into this world, I think would be absolutely fascinating. Another thing, and I guess this would be maybe impossible to do based on, licensing and stuff like that, but could you imagine having a VR 8-bit sort of Nintendo world where, you have that sort of pixelated art and you are the character, moving through these worlds? I mean, I imagine that as a kid, what if I could, go into the screen and be Mario, and I actually think that would be doable in the sense that, that's probably not as graphically intense as, say, something like a modern third-person shooter. Of course, Nintendo will never let that happen, but maybe you can get some other franchises like a Mega Man or something like that. So there is promise. I think also the claim, and I'm going to say that, I have not demoed these devices, but, I think there is something to be said for seeing your desktop in 3D, just simulating a huge movie screen, which is something that a lot of these products claim to do. And by the way, let's not leave out products like the Royal X, which the Royal X, if you don't know what that is what they call it a personal home theater. It's a set of really high-powered headphones, noise-canceling headphones that supposedly provide a it's either 5.1 or 7.1 surround sound effect, and an OLED screen that sort of, goes around your peripheral vision, and it supposedly creates a high-definition, I think they call it a 120-inch screen theater or something like that, or some degree of immersive theater that sort of surrounds and gives you like a peripheral effect, like a curved screen. And that is interesting. The reason why that's interesting is it has a control box with a couple of HDMI ports and USB 3.0 ports, so you can consume any kind of media, including any video game console that has an HDMI cable. Now, that is something that I haven't heard about Oculus or the Vive doing, or the PlayStation VR doing. But, I think that would provide a lot of value if you got, certainly not a 3D experience, but at least an immersive home theater type experience, with your PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 library. That is something, or even just your Blu-ray collection, that is something that would allow me to jump in. Now, there are problems with the Royal X. I think it's an XGA screen or something like that. So, I think in the end, the smart move will be to, and obviously this is a smart move with any technology, any new technology, wait for it to mature, wait for the price to come down, and don't kind of be the quote-unquote sucker who buys everything at launch. I never used to feel that way. For a number of years, if the product interested me, if I saw that there was potential in the product, I would actually pick it up, because, the trade-off, of course, was different. Back in the day, you would buy a product at launch. Take the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo with Pilot Wings and F-Zero and Mario World, didn't have any hardware issues. It had a very, very limited game library. It had a, I guess, fairly high cost of entry, but, you were trading the ubiquity of NES titles for a very, very small library, but it was quality, and then you could just wait. Here, I look at my PlayStation 4, and as I said, if you follow the YouTube channel, you'll know the issues I've had with that. Within a year, the disk drive was broken, spitting out discs mid-game, and, that is totally unacceptable. So, speaking of PlayStation, the other hardware rumor that really was swirling around the internet was the introduction of the PlayStation 4.5, and of course also the Xbox One kind of hardware upgrade that might be coming, and a kind of shift in console hardware, an attempt really for the first time to have incremental performance upgrades across a console generation. And I have to say I'm very, very skeptical of this. The point's been made that the beauty of console hardware is that you buy it, you put games in, and you're good to go from 4 to 10 years. And I'm not saying that that's not a valid point. That is a very valid point. The issue that I have is that this is a kind of tacit admission by Sony and Microsoft that they screwed up with the release of the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. These were and are underpowered consoles. They are, not really filling the needs, the needs of the modern gamer, in the sense that what you expected going into this console generation was, at the very least, 1080p native, 60 frames per second. And they can't meet that. And that arguably should have been done with the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 generation, but we're still not at that point. And the fact that we are not is really an indictment. Yes, they wanted to hit a lower price point, and I appreciate that, but the move to kind of incremental improvements is something that I think is ultimately going to be bad for customers, because it's going to allow them, much like the developers who release a game and constantly patch it, it's going to allow them to never fully release a complete hardware product. Yep, they screwed up in 2013. In 2016 or 17, you're going to get an incremental hardware upgrade that will allow you to hopefully play games 1080p, 60 frames per second, and maybe do some, enhanced lighting effects and probably, 4K movies, 4K streaming. Maybe they'll put in a UHD Blu-ray player. Now, obviously, they couldn't do the UHD Blu-ray stuff in 2013. But, I think the incentive is always going to be to hold back a little bit and force upgrades, much in the same way that cell phones force upgrades. But I'm not sure that that is what the console player wants. And if you were constantly going to go down that path and have this obviously very closed hardware environment, you may as well just buy a PC when you can sort of schedule the upgrades as you see fit. Get some deals on different components and not be reliant on Sony or Microsoft to, come out with the product and, you just have to pay whatever they charge. If they were to do something, if it were a completely modular system, let's put it that way, then I could see, say, hey, every 3 years you're going to, hit this button, pop out your video card, stick in this new one, and you'll get the enhanced resolution and effects. Something similar to the Nintendo 64 extra RAM packet, something like that. That's fine. To sort of say, every year, we're just going to call it just like the iPhone or the iPad. Hey, this is the PlayStation 4 2017 edition, 2018 edition. And if you want the quote-unquote pro experience or enthusiast experience, this is the one you're going to have to buy. That's not going to work out well. And then you have to consider the development side of things. Developers, as I mentioned, are struggling to put out quality products on day one. Street Fighter V, I am looking at you. So now you're going to give them, multiple hardware configurations that they have to worry about. Are they going to, have a learning curve on the new configuration, screw that up? Are they going to work for the enthusiast configuration and leave everyone in the dust? It just, to me, introduces a kind of built-in compensatory mechanism for laziness on the one hand, and then also just a minefield of errors and issues for the end user on the other hand. Now, I'm sure it will be extremely profitable for both companies, but I know for me personally, having started building another gaming PC, that I'm going to be inclined to game on that, because I look at what my current gaming PC has given me. I built it at the very start of 2011 with the new Sandy Bridge components, and over the years I upgraded the video card and stuff like that. But the old, now 5-year-old SSD drive, the performance of the machine has remained very, very consistent throughout that time, and then I can decide, when is it time to move. I had a Crossfire 6850 configuration, and then I said, okay, it's time to upgrade to the GTX 780, and I did that, when it worked for me, and I had an improved performance, but, there was never a dip, and obviously hardware vendors, are used to that for the PC. So I would look at that very, very cautiously, and it actually makes me wonder and even be even more interested in what Nintendo's coming out with. So let's talk about Nintendo. Let's talk about the NX. Before we get into that, I just want to say a few things about the Nintendo Wii and kind of the announcement. Again, I don't think this has been confirmed, at least as of now, but that they're going to stop Wii U hardware production at the end of 2016. And yeah, I mean, I think whether that is true or not, we are at the end of the life of the Wii U, and I think it's a life that never really got started. I think the Wii U is going to go down as a fascinating failure of a console, and I say that as someone who bought the Wii U, I don't want to say it was on day one, but it was within the first week. It was the first console that I think I bought, within that first week. Obviously, I bought others within the launch window. I was, for that first year, and I'm still feeling this now, I'm waiting for the Wii U to ever get started. I don't think the Wii U, and this is going to piss a lot of people off, I don't think the Wii U has really had a lot of serious single-player experiences. There are only three that come to mind that are unique to the console. One, obviously, is Super Mario 3D World, which is an amazing, amazing game. It's the highlight of the system for me. Then you, of course, have Bayonetta 2, which, came with the reworked Bayonetta 1. I'm not a fan of, who does that, Platinum Games. Again, a lot of people are going to, send me some hate for that, but I think they, by and large, are games that lead you from one Michael Bay type massive explosion-laden fight to the next. I don't feel particularly engaged by them. I think they're just an excuse to show you some really flashy eye candy. Yeah, they have some interesting control schemes, but yeah, at the end of the day, I could live without them. And then, of course, you have the what do they call it? Xenoblade Chronicles X. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that game in a later segment, but that is certainly just a massive, expansive, single-player experience. What other games give you that on the system? Obviously, you have the Zelda remakes. Again, I have those games for the GameCube and the Wii, so I will not rebuy them. And then, of course, Mario Kart and Smash Brothers. And I've never really seen those as engaging, single-player games. To me, they're party games, and they're fine, and they're excellent examples, and they're some of the best party games ever released. Yet, I don't want to sit. I don't get any enjoyment out of sitting and playing Smash Brothers against the CPU. Obviously, you can play online. I've got a whole video about why I don't like Smash Brothers, but it's my girlfriend's favorite game, so we'll sit down and we'll have a lot of fun with it. That's something I'm going to do on my own time. Mario Kart is the same way for me. And those were, two of the highly touted releases. So you have those, obviously Splatoon, which a lot of people love. I have admittedly not played Splatoon, but I'm not a fan of sort of cooperative online shooters, but that's it. Now you had the Luigi version of Super Mario Brothers Wii U, obviously the original Super Mario Brothers Wii U. Those games were okay. Captain Toad was a really sort of sleeper hit, I think. I think that game was very good, but aside from that, there's not a lot of stuff to play on the Wii U. Some people will say that it's the fault of Nintendo for really not courting the third-party game developers. And I've always said that, they need to be selective in courting third-party game developers. To me, I don't want to play Call of Duty on a Nintendo system. I don't want to play Batman on a Nintendo system. Let Sony and Microsoft have those kind of titles. Yes, will it mean that the platform is viable? Okay, yes, it means that the platform is viable. Of course, that perhaps helps in the long run, but I think the key mistake for Nintendo was not courting the Atlas and the NIS and really getting, making the Wii U the platform for those niche kind of Japanese titles. I also think they shot themselves in the foot by not releasing Earthbound, a new Earthbound game. I think that would have sold some consoles to all of the kind of retro people who are on the fence about the Wii U, or developing some new property. So, yeah, I think those are some pretty severe mistakes, and I'm going to be kind of hypocritical here. I love Nintendo. I've been a Nintendo head, every Nintendo system, and so that gross miscalculation about the Wii U doesn't mean that I'm going to avoid the NX, and in fact, if there was ever a platform that I would want to pick up day one, it would be the NX. So we don't know what the NX is. Obviously, you had those strange-looking, oval-shaped touchscreen controllers that surfaced a couple weeks ago. But what does Nintendo have to do to right the wrongs of the Wii U and sort of, I would say, excite, perhaps re-engage their fan base? The question of physical media. I think you want physical media. It doesn't have to be a disc. It can be sort of a 3DS type card, but I don't think they want to completely remove physical media. I would, on the question of whether it should be a hybrid, portable, and console system, they could do that. I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea, but I would want them to serve both usage scenarios equally well. I'm not sure that they can do that. I'm a huge 3DS fan. I love Nintendo handheld games, and I don't want the dedicated Nintendo handheld experience to be cheapened by the fact that, so we're going to have this, whatever this is it going to be a controller that can really function on its own, unlike the Wii U controller? Or is it going to be a truly portable system and then some sort of HD TV dongle? I don't want to see Nintendo, sacrifice either of those experiences. And if there's a company that can find a truly substantive balance and approach to sort of serve those two ends, it is Nintendo. They can do it. But we'll see if that happens. Then the other thing that I would really like to see with the NX is they need to abandon this trend since the Wii and the 3D and the Nintendo DS of having some sort of unique input scenario. Just allow us to control the game normally. I don't want to use a stylus. I don't want to use motion controls. I don't want augmented reality, with the exception of that VR idea that I had about sort of going into a 3D world of, old school Nintendo games. I really don't want them to embrace any kind of cheap VR. I just want to be able to sit down on my couch in front of my TV and play Nintendo, or alternately to sort of, lay in my bedroom or, go on the road, with my Nintendo handheld and just play video games as, in my opinion, they were meant to be played. And that is just, with the standard button and joystick inputs. So if Nintendo can take that approach, that's great. As far as whatever else they want to put in there, it doesn't need to be as powerful as the PS4 and Xbox One or their incremental upgrades that are coming. I think the question of power is important, but I think it's overstated. The Wii U, obviously not as powerful, but really produced some beautiful, beautiful graphics. To me, that, as long as it's roughly competitive, that's fine. I'm okay with that. Okay, other Nintendo news, we have Miitomo, and I figured I don't play mobile games. I don't like mobile games for the most part. But I had to download Miitomo and try it out. And I would have to say, bemused, really, by what I saw. Miitomo, I don't know what to really do with it. Obviously, you create your avatar, or you use your me, and it felt honestly like an interrogation, asking me all sorts of questions. Oh, what is your favorite movie? What commercial did you like recently? Where do you go to have fun? What are you afraid of? I mean, it felt like, who the hell is reading this stuff? I'd love to know the NSA officer who is being tasked with, reading through millions of Miitomo question responses to try to figure out, or to try to figure out where the next terrorist threat is coming, or just to, gauge the mood of the populace, as it were. I guess you can add friends and then read their responses, and sometimes it'll ask you questions about what your friends said. Of course, I don't have any friends, really. I friends with, just one other person on there. So I started putting in nonsense responses or, snarky responses. And it was actually funny because, I didn't know how to progress the game. So I was like, okay, well, let me respond and just keep on responding. I mean, can I leave the house? Is there some Nintendo DLC reward? Nothing essentially happened. You get points for answering 3 questions a day, and so I got a hat and a spacesuit or whatever the hell it was. But it actually cut me off at one point. It said, "Boy, don't you seem tired? I'm tired now," and it shut off. So I guess if you're not providing it with the information that it wants, it sort of disconnects you from the service. But if you want to go read, if you want to. I don't think I'll be on there that frequently, but look for, W. Cladley, all lowercase, all one word, same as my YouTube channel. I think I had some pretty funny responses, so you can at least read through those before they dissolve into the ether. Is this going to be a real boon for Nintendo? I mean, I think it's great that they want to expand into the mobile market, and I don't think that the traditional Nintendo game would play well with a touchscreen. On the other hand, I don't think this is a strong effort, especially for someone like me who is a little bit wary of social media, doesn't use it all that frequently, at least as far as Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all of that stuff. I think, they would need to give me some tangible reward across the other systems to make me want to continue using Miitomo on a regular basis. I mean, if, this currency that you're earning, is going to get me a 3DS game, one of those like a Sega Classic or a Nintendo Classic or something, yeah, then maybe I would continue using it. Aside from that, I just honestly don't see the enjoyment that can be derived from it, and I would not want to actually answer these questions honestly and have a dossier of, rather intimate information in the hands of any corporation. I mean, they could trust Nintendo over AT&T, but all the same, I'd just rather not use the software in that way. So I think one of the broader questions that we should be asking at this time is the extent to which software is going to have to change to embrace this, what I would consider to be a radically different breed of hardware in the VR headsets, and also, even in the consoles that will attempt to implement virtual reality. So what do I mean by that? I would say that, by and large, we have 4 different, what I'll call meta-genres of gaming. We have, on the one hand, you have your AAA titles. I'm going to include sports games in there, these big budget games that are ultimately very derivative. It's the same type of experience whether it's Call of Duty or Battlefield, as far as first-person shooters, third-person action games, cinematic, quote-unquote, experience is a term which I actually really hate, but, you think of Uncharted and games like that, and of course the sports games, which also follow a very similar pattern. They sort of replicate themselves and, upgrade themselves only slightly within the course of a console generation. And they're very profitable, obviously, but they're also challenged in the sense that they're very expensive to make. You have Final Fantasy 15 coming out and saying that, I don't know who said this, it was either the president of Square Enix or the head designer on Final Fantasy that said Final Fantasy will need to sell 10 million copies to turn a profit. So this business model, I think, is in jeopardy long term. Second meta genre of game is the indie game. And, I have a somewhat, how shall I say it? I have an uncomfortable relationship with indie games simply because I find that, as I've said elsewhere in other formats, they kind of give you the illusion of innovation. The sense that they are something modern and avant-garde, when, again, ultimately they are, in many instances, very derivative. For every Gone Home or Brothers Tale of Two Sons game or Stanley Parable that really, does indeed try something different and can stand on its own merits, you have others that just try to replicate the retro feel to suggest to their audiences that, hey, we're all in on the hip, hipster retro in-joke. So, come ironically relive your pasts with this game. I think it's a model that also cannot sustain itself long term, except for the, as I said, the few high-quality ones that have been released. We might say that the third meta-genre is the niche Japanese game. And by that I mean most of Nintendo's efforts, plus what you see from Atlas, NIS, Gust, Xseed, things like that, games that are somewhat more traditional in their scope, and again are ultimately the products of Japanese development. And obviously they have been on the decline. And then, of course, as the fourth genre, I would have to include, even though I don't particularly play these games, the online competitive MOBA sort of game, which is actually in its ascendancy. But I think VR is going to challenge these four models, and I think it's going to do it actually in a very positive way. Virtual reality, I think, can't be a all-encompassing 3D representation of the same aesthetics, the same mechanics, and the same gameplay that you've seen in all of these, these four meta-genres. I think with virtual reality, we're going to have to ask ourselves, and the developers are going to have to ask themselves, a very serious question, and that is, how do we make these games compelling to the player? Because now, for the first time, we are not observing a virtual world. We ultimately will be a part of it. And I don't think that in that instance we would necessarily want to play Call of Duty with the Xbox controller and just, see the bullets flashing from our periphery vision. I mean, you can make a very compelling game that gives you the sense of being in the military, being in combat, but I don't know that it's going to be the same sort of standard, cut and paste first-person shooter that we've played before. I also don't think that the quote-unquote cinematic experience is going to be that compelling in 3D, because ultimately we want to feel that we are a part of this world and not just playing through a series of flashy cutscenes, nor do we want to be, sort of on rails in a film. I mean, that is essentially, it could be the VR representation of what we saw in the FMV games in the early 90s. Here's this video or movie, and you are ostensibly a character who sort of presses a few buttons to progress the narrative. I'm not sure that that's going to sustain itself, I think we are in a position where the ideal, and it might take a few years for this to develop, but you want to experience a world. And if we think about the way we experience this world, it is at its base level, a non-linear fashion. Now, we may have routines. We may drive to work, on the same road. We may, have the same set of tasks that we do on a daily basis. But we ultimately experience, relationships. We experience, particularly, I think, if you travel to a new city, it's all very non-linear. If you arrive in Paris and you get off at the main train station, you're not funneled down one road. You have essentially the freedom to do whatever you want. And I think that's a new type of game freedom, potentially, where you're not presented with path 1, path 2, path 3, but you can sort of roam around and have the narrative of the game or have the skill set of the game reveal itself to you, slowly and in a number of different ways. And that's going to be a challenge. That's why I said before, I think that the Bethesda-style games are best suited to this new technology, because they are games in which the narrative of the world is so deep and so dispersed that you could spend your time searching for the books and reading up on the history of Cyrodiil before you actually engage with closing the gates of Oblivion. That's the sort of thing I think you want. You want to experience a different reality. And I think the more that experience occurs organically, the more engrossing these games will be. Now, the question is, can game design fundamentally get to a point where it is truly non-linear and multiple in its presentation, or will we always have a set of options and a set of decisions with which we are ultimately confronted? I'm not really sure that we are anywhere near the point where that latter possibility is or the possibility of true quasi-freedom is possible. I think we will always have to boil it down to a set of decisions, a set of tasks, but I think they can be kind of layered within a world in a way that makes it truly feel like quote-unquote freedom. Now, obviously, the other point to that is, are video games really about simulating freedom, or are they about manipulating your set of choices to induce certain behaviors under the guise of what feels like freedom? And this was easy to do in the jump from 2D to 3D, but I think the curtain is being pulled back on that at this point. So I'll give you another example. I think there's a rich field of games that you might want to call or consider to be, historical recreations. What was it like to find yourself in ancient Egypt or Rome or Germany during World War II, simulating other human experiences? And not to sound grim, but could you imagine a game that really shows you what it may have been like to be a prisoner in a concentration camp, or simulates the life of a slave in the American South? I think it creates an opportunity in that type of setting for a historical and emotional intimacy that you couldn't have before. To say nothing of the ability to, and they are developing these sorts of things, to go through museums and churches and things like that. But it all fundamentally is going to revolve around the world seeming authentic. And how does the world seem authentic? It is a world that you are a part of. It is a world that reveals itself to you in an organic and natural way. And I think to get to that point, developers, hopefully, if they're thinking critically about this, will move away from the video game as the Hollywood film model. I think we've had enough of that. We don't want interactive digital experiences that are like a Marvel movie with, moderate to poor character development and lots of explosions and battles. I think virtual reality is an attempt to be more nuanced in the production, consumption, and appreciation of games. Alright, so I want to end the hardware talk with a couple hardware reviews that I have been sitting on for a while. 3 kind of not gaming products in themselves, but tangentially related to gaming. And it's interesting. One of my hobbies is to kind of look at how we can integrate other tech products into the gaming experience. Nothing revolutionary, but I think there are all sorts of kind of interesting products out there that can be usefully employed in the hobby of gaming. And I'm going to talk about 3 of them today. Start off with the first one, which is, I think, obviously gamers discuss monitors, and I found myself in an interesting position a couple of months ago. My computer monitor, which was a monoprice 4K monitor, was breaking. It was not being recognized by the PC. It was getting very washed out in its color reproduction. And as I was kind of looking around at the available monitors, that monitor, that 28-inch 4K monitor by monoprice, that panel is widely used and is still used today in basically any 28-inch 4K monitor that you're going to get. I should say that I did not pay full price for that. Monoprice sent it to me as a replacement for an older monitor that had broken at no cost to me. So I kind of got onto the 4K, scene, if you will, for a very reasonable price. I think it was $800 at the time. The monitor I had purchased was $300 or $350, and they just sent this to me as an upgrade because they didn't make that old monitor. So, I will give them credit for that, but the old monitor and this monitor, not very good. I guess maybe it's the luck of the draw with them. But anyways, I was looking around. I found a lot of stagnation in what is out there for monitors. Now, the 4K monitors that you're going to buy out there are hard to drive. You need a serious graphics card. My GTX 780 was, actually to my surprise, capable of playing some games in 4K, notably things like the Hitman game that came out a couple of years ago, and a few others, Virtua Tennis 4, and was able to, sustain a pretty good frame rate on those games. But other games, it would just sort of chug along. So I would actually just reduce the resolution to 2K. This actually helped with usability of the screen. I guess I'm getting to that age where my vision is not what it once was. So, I wasn't really sold on needing a 4K monitor, but even 2K monitors, G-Sync monitors, all incredibly expensive. So I found an LG UltraWide monitor. This is the 34UM67, and this monitor is a compromise in a lot of ways. Yes, it is a 34-inch ultra-wide, and that has its benefits, but it's 2560 by 1080. So essentially a 1080p monitor. It is a downgrade in a lot of ways for my 2K and 4K monoprice monitors, and it took some getting used to. Text is not great. The everyday computing experience on there is not great, but you adjust to it, and of course, if you have trouble, with small, high-resolution icons, you won't have a problem with this monitor. But what really surprised me about this monitor is that it's great for PC gaming, and I know, well, that's, it's a PC gaming monitor, that's not an insight, but there's something about it, very hard to describe, but for as bad as the general computing experience looks, when you fire up a game, it has incredible crisp detail and incredibly vibrant colors, and if you boost up something like NVIDIA vibrancy, I mean, the monitor is just soaked in eye-popping color on any of the games that you want to play. It's now again, some people don't like that. I like colors that pop off the screen, and this does that better than any monitor that I've seen or used. So it kind of makes up for that with the resolution. I don't know how it does it. That when you're in a game, that lack of resolution, that resolution downgrade, doesn't affect me, and I'm sitting right up close to the screen. Of course, it is a very immersive experience to have that ultra wide monitor if you have the real estate on your desk. And while it's big, I've just fit it in there. Ultra smooth. I'm not taking advantage. It is a FreeSync monitor where with a certain frequency it will adjust the frame rate that you can get out of it in a certain frequency range. But since I have an NVIDIA card, I'm not taking advantage of that. But it's very easy to drive because it's essentially 1080p. So I would say this is a really good pickup. It's sold initially for I think $750. I got mine for $475, and I would imagine that this is now cheaper. Actually, let me look here. I got it from Amazon. It is actually not cheaper. It is $530 now. But this is the type of monitor, once the new stuff comes out, I would imagine that they would discount this because LG already has I think a 4K version of this. Obviously, you have the Dell Ultra Sharp, UltraWide, 34, whatever it is, by 2160s. So these are going to go down in price, and I would say if you can find this for $399 or below, that this is probably a good bet because you're going to get, or at least in my case, and I know people love the super high resolution. You're going to say, okay, I'm not a true PC gamer, I'm only using it at 60 hertz. It's like, whatever the case is, if you're looking for a deal, I think this is going to be a good monitor once it starts to be phased out. You're going to put up with, like I said, the bad general computing experience. You're also going to put up with, and it's going to depend on how sensitive you are to this, backlight bleed. Not so much in everyday computing, but you'll notice it, and not even in super dark scenes, but like when the computer's booting up or when it's going into sleep mode, that instance right before the screensaver cuts off, you'll notice some pretty significant backlight bleed, as you would expect from an IPS panel, but it's not that really angular backlight bleed that I've seen where there's like a cone of light. It seems to be very evenly distributed across the panel so that blacks are more grayish than spotty, and I can put up with that. But I'll tell you, it is an impressive monitor for gaming, and I haven't really read exactly why. Why does it look so much better in games and so poor in regular computing? When I say poor, I mean it's not unusably poor. It's not something where I'm struggling to use my internet browser. I mean the only program that has really affected is video editing software, where I can see less of the kind of lines where I can add content. So that's the only hit to everyday usability. But like I said, if you can find this for under $400, and I think it'll probably be there in a couple months, it's a great monitor to get, and then just wait for the prices of the super high-end stuff to come down, and wait for G-Sync to become more widely available. That's what I intend to do. I think maybe I'll move in the ultra-wide 4K direction in a year or two, but I'm kind of happy to have this. And the second of the three products I want to talk about is actually a Blu-ray player. It is the Oppo 103D. Now, the D stands for something called Dolby Visual Presence, and what this is it used to be a standalone kind of a dongle-looking product, and you would sort of, if you had a home theater, you'd take the HDMI out of your AV receiver, stick it into this, what they call the darblet, and then run an HDMI into your television or a projector. And what this Darby visual presence is essentially a contrast and color enhancer, but with supposedly some really slick algorithms to enhance the image. I find it, and of course this player has that built in, so I should say that. So this player, in addition to being a great Blu-ray player, has this built in, and it's going to work, I think, better for certain setups than others. A lot of owners of projectors would get this because, apparently it can really enhance the color and contrast of a standard projector. I think it's great on OLED because obviously you have that, infinite, very consistent black, and so when you add that contrast, there's a pop to it. They're going to say it kind of looks like a 3D image in your screen. That's not quite the case, even when you sort of crank it up. But they make a gaming claim. Oppo, the manufacturer of the Blu-ray player, and Darby themselves, and they said that this will enhance video games. This will make video games look better. So it seemed like, okay, I wanted a high-end videophile Blu-ray player, and hey, this is, it's got some sort of gaming functionality, so let me test it out. And I did. And this was not a scientific test, but I'll give you the results. Basically, this was adding a lot of delay. So, it has an HDMI in the front of the Blu-ray player, plugged in the Xbox, PS4, and initially I thought, well, are my systems breaking, or is there a slowdown in the game? It really made the games borderline to completely unplayable, even though it did make them look great. It added a lot of pop to the games. So I was doing some reading on this, and basically, and I don't know, obviously take these numbers with a grain of salt. They just came from audio, video forums and stuff like that. But they claimed that the darblet, or the processing chip in the Blu-ray player, introduces about 20 milliseconds of lag time. Now, I'm using the LG OLED display, which is not great for response time in games. It, depending on the setting, will give you between 42 to 50 milliseconds of delay, which I don't really notice in everyday gaming. I guess I'm not a competitive gamer. I'm not playing Street Fighter online for, like to rank up and stuff like that. So it's fine for everyday gaming. But when you add that 20 ms plus on top of it, it does make it very, very difficult to play. Now, I suspect that if you use a different, if you have a different monitor, it may give you some results. I mean, if your response time, if you're using a gaming monitor and your response time is 4 milliseconds, 5 milliseconds, adding 20 may not be the end of the world. If you have some of the Samsung TVs that have the kind of game mode that gets it into the teens, and adding 20 might not be terrible. But this is something that you want to, I would say, avoid in most instances for gaming. Now, like I said, I didn't take down my OLED and hook up my old rear projection television, which when I bought it, they said, oh, it's not the response time is measured in micro seconds or whatever. Like, it has virtually no lag. I wasn't gonna. You need two people to move the OLED, because it's heavy, because it's so fragile. So anyway, I suspect that if I had done that, maybe the results would have been better. But don't buy this for its gaming functionality. Plus, the actual effect, the visual effect, it makes already impressive-looking games look just that little bit more impressive. Is it worth $300 standalone or $680 for the Blu-ray player? No, it is not. Now, if you're, but this is not to say this is a wonderful Blu-ray player. You can look; there are tons of reviews online. It is really top of the line, and the Derby for movies and stuff like that is great. So I'm not tearing down the product, but it is not a gaming product. And then lastly, I want to talk about a set of headphones that I got. They're the RBS HP2s. Now, I was reading a website called Audioholics, and they have actually a very amusing YouTube channel. They have some expertise, but they are not the best in producing YouTube videos. Anyway, they were raving about these headphones, and they said, this is, a true advancement in audiophile technology for $200 at an introductory price. You're getting these absolutely incredible headphones with prodigious bass response and incredible detail and beryllium-coated drivers, and these are the best headphones you can buy. They're better than $1,000 headphones, stuff like that. So I was in the market for new headphones, and I said, well, for $200 shipped, no tax, that is somewhat cheaper than kind of the mid-range stuff that you can get from other vendors. And they have a no questions asked, I think, 60-day return policy or 30-day return policy, and they'll pay shipping. So I said, I'll give it a try. And what was interesting about these headphones is that they have a supposedly very high sensitivity. Now, if you've ever purchased high-end headphones, you'll know that they are very, very difficult to drive. And if you don't have a headphone amp or a good receiver, they're not going to sound good. And I had purchased some headphones like that in the past, not $1,000 audiophile headphones, but headphones that, from Koss, their Titanium Pro series, and actually those are still good values. But as far as the sound of some of the higher-end Koss headphones, you need an amp, and they don't sound very good, and they sound, kind of soft when you plug them in to devices like cell phones and or 3DS, PS Vita, and so forth. So I said, I'm going to test out this claim. Is this the case? And I have to say that it is. They do better, and they sound better than other, these are, big over-the-ear headphones. They are easier to drive, and what that means is that on the, particularly on the 3DS, which Nintendo, I should have mentioned this in the part about the NX/new handheld, they need to get the sound right. The 3DS, for as much as I love it, has terrible sound. Headphones help, but it's just there's just not a lot of power there to power headphones. And so you plug these in, and it sounds better. It really does sound better than other headphones that I've used, earbuds and the Koss stuff and stuff like that. PlayStation Vita as well. They really isolate you. They do sound more engrossing than some other products that I've used. Now, for music, I'm not a big music person. I'll use these to play, and I've used them to play PC games sometimes at night. You want a set of headphones. And for that, they are also very good. But I did try them out for music, and I got with the Oppo player, a 3-month subscription to, what is it called, Tidal or something like that? Tidal it is, Tidal, and that is a hi-fi music streaming service. So, if you ever downloaded like FLAC files, this is supposedly the streaming equivalent of that. And I have to say, you do hear much more detail in music with this service and these headphones versus something like iTunes or YouTube or whatever else you're going to use, certainly the standard MP3. So I would say, this is a little pricier than I wanted to go on headphones, but yet it's less than kind of the mid to high end stuff. So I yeah, I think audio is very subjective. Some people won't like the fact that they are indeed very bass heavy, but they still get those bright highs. But I think for overall computer gaming and just the fact that it's easier to drive on handheld gaming consoles, I think it's, like I said, it's worth a try. Is it the most, am I head over heels? Is it the greatest advancement in audio products in the past 20 years? I would say from my experience, no. Maybe if you test these out scientifically and you look at the frequency response times and everything like that, and you compare them across the board, but maybe they are interestingly designed. But I would say it's a good solid headphone, and if you're just playing with earbuds, or you're finding that the sound on the PS Vita and 3DS is a little lacking, try these out. You're still going to have to crank the volume up, but cranking the volume up with these headphones, that really results in kind of a nicer experience than with other models that I've used. So moving on to some video game news, I wanted to weigh in on this censorship kind of firestorm that's been going on online. Of course, you have two games that were recently censored for overly sexualized female characters. One was some character in the Overwatch game, which I've never played and have no interest in playing. The other, I think, was Star Ocean 5. There was some sort of shot of a character that was deemed inappropriate. We also saw this with Street Fighter V, with the Arm Mika ass slap being removed from Western versions of the game, and it invariably sends a lot of people into, an outrage that Japan would do this. And, I think one of the developers saying that, they don't quite understand. They just don't want to piss off the American market, so they're just going to do it, and they don't sort of know the cultural background behind it. So what do I think about this? I'm against censorship. I think any kind of politically motivated censorship is generally a bad thing. Now, there are exceptions. I mean, there are certain things that should not be allowed as far as depictions go. Obviously, things like bestiality or, child pornography, things like that. Obviously, that should be censored and punished and all the rest of it. When it comes to the sexualized female form, I think, it, on the one hand, I would just say let the game come out, let people, this is a cultural product from a different country. Let people react to it as they may. And I think the Star Ocean 5, was a panty shot on a young-ish looking girl. I mean, there was the same thing with, Xenoblade Chronicles, where, they had a character who, you could change their appearance and make their boobs bigger or smaller or something like that. I think what is the harm of leaving that in there? Let people react to it. If we find that and I think people would find that the kind of Japanese sexualization of young girls, ambiguously young girls, is probably a bad thing. It probably, it's unnecessary. It's crude, and who cares? I mean, it's 4 seconds of footage. Let people arrive at that judgment themselves. Let them debate it. You don't need to censor it. On the other hand, I agree with critics who say that the overall portrayal of women in video games is fundamentally negative. I mean, people don't want to admit this. The people who complain about this, let's face it, running over prostitutes in Grand Theft Auto, after they've had sex with you and you steal the money back, not a positive portrayal, all right? It's not something as fun as it seemed to me when I was in college and drinking with my buddies and playing that game. I can look back and say, my enjoyment of that version of female exploitation is not a kind of positive cultural representation. And quite frankly, I mean, I can say that even though, it might be, titillating to sort of see a naked girl in a video game, I realize that that's a kind of prurient sort of thing on my part, and I think people have a right to criticize that. So, you can enjoy stuff that is objectively damaging to other people. What does that say about you? Well, you have to have the intellectual courage to confront yourself on that topic. I also find it kind of funny how the people that criticize this stuff, that's, the social justice warriors. Oh, the social justice warriors are out there. They're destroying everything for the rest of us. You wouldn't want to be a fucking social justice warrior. It's kind of funny that term is used as a pejorative. I think social justice is actually a very positive thing to strive for. And I think we need social justice warriors in a world of extreme social and economic injustice. So I think that misses the point. I think a lot of these guys don't like the Anita Sarkeesians who come out and kind of, in there with that sort of slight overtone of superiority, critique the entertainment that we love. So, I think we need to stop, insulting people who are, fighting for social justice. It shouldn't be a pejorative term. What I would say on the flip side, though, is I do see, to a degree, that video games are a target for this kind of critique, an easier target. And I would suggest a target that is not as meaningful as other targets out there. The portrayal of women in advertising and in Hollywood has been historically and consistently much worse than their portrayal in video games. And for every great, actress out there who's done, some amazing roles, there have been, exploitative uses of the female body consistently across all media. So if people like Sarkeesian would come out and attack all of it, and maybe they have. I haven't followed Sarkeesian for a while, but you need to attack all of it. You need to not single out video games as a particularly reprehensible site of this offense, and really tackle American culture as a whole, which knows that sex sells and uses sex to sell everything. So by censoring the panty shot of a character in Star Ocean 5, in, removing the R. Mika ass slap, I mean, it may give people the feel of progressive politics, the sense that they are making some meaningful social change, but in the end, what is really being accomplished there? I would say stop censoring video games unless they represent something truly morally reprehensible, like the examples I gave before, and let people come to their own conclusions. Let, hey, maybe a company is going to have to say, this is the game that we developed. Let's put it in there and see what happens. And maybe for all the sales it generates amongst, young teenage guys who are excited by that sort of thing, the women will have a backlash against it, or people will say, it doesn't matter. It's not that important. Let the consumer decide. Let the fight play out in, respectfully in the arena of public opinion. And let's just say, hey, this is a product from a different culture. They have different ideas about female sexuality than we do. They think this is okay. I may not agree with it. But for something as minuscule as that, let's not censor it. And it actually brings me to a story, and I'll end this segment with this story. I remember I spent a lot of time in Europe, as between high school and college, and then again in college. And in high school and after high school, I lived with a family in Germany. And so when I got there, they had this nice house, and they took me to the guest room, and they was putting my stuff away. And I noticed, on the walls they had all of these VHS tapes, and some of them were porno films. And coming from America, being a high school kid, I was like, whoa, what was that? And I guess they noticed the reaction, and they said, oh, does that bother you? Those are some French erotic films that, and we, as the parents, that we enjoyed. Hey, don't worry about it. It's just entertainment. It's just entertainment. And I think that's the... that should be the mindset that we work towards here in this country. Some stuff is just entertainment. You have to separate your sort of ethical and intellectual and adult life from the entertainment products that you consume. I think in the United States, we tend to, we need to create these taboos because it makes the product seem more engaging. Hey, I'm not supposed to be watching this sort of a thing, but I am, and I like it. It creates this, sense of excitement around products, When, and again, it's not for everything, but as far as sexualized depiction of women in video games, it is also possible. While we don't need the extreme Grand Theft Auto examples per se, if it occurs, you may just say, hey, it's happened in a video game. This video game doesn't define my life or my perspective on life. I would not want to see my girlfriend in this costume. This is not how I treat women, and just move on. I mean, they had and it wasn't just with this example of the videos in their guest room, when they were watching TV and and they had this little kid who would watch everything, and it was no problem. And they just had this idea that it's entertainment. It may be nonsensical, it may be goofy, maybe it's something of very little intellectual substance, but you just do it because you want to relax, you watch this or that on television, and they would just move on with their lives. I'd actually like to see more of that in the discourse here in the United States. So I mentioned this earlier in the show. I've been playing Xenoblade Chronicles, or at least trying to play it, and I really hate the battle system in that game. And it got me thinking about JRPG battle systems. And this was only compounded by the fact that the Final Fantasy demo is out. Well, I haven't played it myself. I've seen some people play it online, and it seems like it has a kind of very free-flowing third-person action game battle system. Now, I think that's what Xenoblade Chronicles should have had. I have never liked this, what I would call compromised third-person battle system. We see it in the Tales games. It was there to a degree in Ni no Kuni. We have three options, I think. Fundamentally, three options for a good RPG battle system. Traditional turn-based, strategy RPG approach, or this free-flowing combat, which we haven't seen in too many games. In games like the Tales series, in games like Xenoblade Chronicles, this idea that you have a certain amount of action points and that your sort of physical movement around the screen consumes those action points, and then if you run out of them and you haven't attacked or whatever, you're sort of dead in the water. This is, to me, the most unappealing of the RPG systems. If you're going to give me the freedom to move around, let me use my skill and just the input accuracy of the controller to win a battle. In Shenmue, for example, you had that Virtua Fighter-esque system, and I thought that was a great idea. Why can't battles in RPGs work like fighting games? Or, conversely, and this is what came to mind in Final Fantasy 15, why can't they work like a good third-person action game? Now, I will say, I don't think Final Fantasy 15 looks like a particularly good third-person action game. It seemed very, very repetitive and very, very basic in its combat. But why can't you have the leveling up mechanics that we all love from the traditional JRPG combined with a battle system like the battle system in Sleeping Dogs or the Batman, Arkham series? We have excellent third-person battle mechanics that can be implemented in a variety of games if you truly want to give the player that, freedom of movement and that feel of controlling the battle, then let them control the battle. Why do we have to, have this strange and uncomfortable system where, you have these action points and, this attack will use so many of them plus your MP. It just becomes irritating. And I found that with the Xenoblade Chronicles X, brilliant world, just wonderfully designed, one of the best looking games on the Wii U in my opinion, even though there are some jaggies here or there and some surfaces that don't look that great, but it was one of the few games of this generation that made you feel like there is this truly expansive world. And yet when you went out and you try to grind through a lot of those missions and level up your player and do all the, I didn't get very far, but that initial board of missions where you could take on and plant the, whatever you want to call them, the reconnaissance towers throughout the world, it got on my nerves after a while. Just let me have a good turn-based combat system, or give me complete control. Don't try to find this middle ground that ruins both schemes. So I'd be actually curious to know what other listeners out there think. I could do with the traditional turn-based combat that we've had since the 80s. You could put all different sorts of spins on that. I think one of the most brilliant ones really was Persona, where you had this socializing / dating game where you used to level up and actually took that into the battles, and obviously you had the whole crafting element to that. I'm not a huge fan of crafting. I think things like the Monachemias and stuff like that, or the Atei whatever series, I don't know where they are, but that whole crafting series, I think it got to the point where that became overly cumbersome, because what you want in a good JRPG, in my opinion, is a tried and true battle system with maybe some different twists, something to work towards, something that makes grinding better, but not these a million different fool's errands where you have to go out and collect all these things to craft this one item to use in this other, in the set of armors or stuff like that. I personally don't have the time for that, so I thought Bravely Default was so good because it went back to the, you had the job system, you had a traditional battle system, you could change the frequency of the encounters, the ease of the battles. It really crafted that, quote, old-fashioned system to a modern sensibility and did it really well. So, I'm not that interested in Final Fantasy 15, but if it truly is an action game, it truly has, freedom of combat, I might actually consider it, even though I just despised 13. I thought it was just a bad CG anime with too linear progression model, and it turned me off completely to the Final Fantasy series and to Square, really until Bravely Default. But again, I'd be curious to know, listeners want to send me a tweet, or, let me, I guess it's the only way you can do it, send me a tweet. I do have forums, but, they are not active, to say the least. Anyway, let me know what you think. I'd be very curious to see what kind of RPG battle systems that you guys prefer. Now, I wanted to come on and do a Game of the Month. And for this month, I'm going to do a game that is, I think, somewhat overlooked, and justifiably so. And that game is Virtua Fighter Kids for the Saturn. Now, I said justifiably so, not because it's a bad game, but because it's, I think, lost in all of the great Sega 3D fighting games on the Saturn. A lot of them are much better than this, except for the original Virtua Fighter. And I've never played Battle Arena Toshinden, so maybe that's not as good. But Virtua Fighter Kids is a riff on Virtua Fighter 2. It uses to my knowledge, the same engine as Virtua Fighter 2, and Virtua Fighter 2 was one of the best 3D fighting games and one of the best 3D games of its era. I've always believed that. I'll stand by that. Virtua Fighter Kids basically shrinks the characters down. It gives you that chibi look, and you can choose between... I think there's like a simpler fighting style, and there's the classic Virtua Fighter 2 arcade style, which is what I use. And you just go through the game playing as these, chibi-style characters. And it controls really, really well. It is Virtua Fighter 2. There are some differences, some range differences, because obviously your head is bigger than your hand, so it includes that. And I've always had fun with this game, and I played it recently, just going through the computer, just playing the computer, going through the arcade mode, playing as the different characters. It offers nothing that Virtua Fighter 2 doesn't. It is not as good as Fighters Megamix, not as good as Fighting Vipers, even though I don't particularly care for Fighting Vipers. It's pales in comparison to Last Bronx. It's an unnecessary game, but it's a guilty pleasure game. And I got my copy for $8 from Japan, and it was, to me, it was worth it. It sounds good. 3D is good. 3D levels are good, and I find that it's a nice complement to Virtua Fighter 2. So what more can I say? It's the game of the month, because I always say that between February and March, I always go back to Virtua Fighter, and I do that because I had a friend who had a birthday. I talked about this in my Virtua Fighter 2 video, if you've watched that, so I won't go into details, but he had a birthday, and he would have it at this arcade, and for whatever reason, I could always get on Virtua Fighter 2 that day, and so Virtua Fighter kind of felt like that period of my youth, and his birthday fell towards the end of February. Sometimes the party was in February, sometimes it was the first week of March, but just that music, just takes me back to, there's still the winter chill in the air, but you can sense better weather on the horizon. That, to me, is the time for Virtua Fighter. And so this year I was like, you know what? I'm going to play the kids version. Just went through that a couple of weeks ago, and still a lot of fun. So in an age where Saturn games are getting very, very expensive, I think this is a nice, reasonable pickup. Certainly if you get the Japanese version. I think the US version is probably, in the 20 to 30 range, probably at this point, which is not unreasonable. I think Virtua Fighter 2, the original Virtua Fighter 2 game is actually much cheaper and better, so pick that one up if you have the Saturn. But yeah, a lot of fun. Virtua Fighter Kids has my recommendation. So a couple weeks back, I did a video called Showdown, and I talked about the, sort of pitting 4 of the most expensive launch consoles against each other, and kind of seeing which one was the best console. So the talk of the end of the Wii U's lifespan and the fact that, it was certainly not a success for Nintendo made me think about talking a little bit about what were the best failed consoles. And I'm not doing the whole deal of pitting one against another, but so I was actually saying, how would we define a failed console? And then how would we establish whether, console X or Y is the best failed console? So I think when you're talking about failed consoles, you have to really establish your criteria. What counts as a failure? So when I posed this question to myself, the first console that came to mind was the TurboGrafx-16, which did objectively fail in the United States. But of course, in Japan, it was an incredible success. So can you say that that is a failed console? I would submit that you can't. I don't think that is a failure, especially when you consider its afterlife and the fact that people avidly collect for the PC Engine. the quality that was there has been discovered. So I would say that, even though it was a market failure in the United States, it was a market success elsewhere, and sort of retroactively, it is retroactively appreciated. Much in the same way, one of my favorite consoles, the Sega Saturn, market failure, gross miscalculation by Sega of America as to what, in what direction the technology was progressing and what the American gamer wanted. But an incredible success in Japan, and it has become one of the darling consoles to collect for. So I don't think we can say that those two systems are failures. Then on the other side of the spectrum, you have things that were abject market failures everywhere. Things like the Apple Pippin, the TigerGames.com. You want to throw in the FM Town Smarty, which of course didn't come out over here, but was, I think a failure. And in fact, in Japan, there's some sort of saying, I forget what it is, but basically, if you mismanage your technology product badly enough, you have like the Marty syndrome, something to that effect. So, those systems weren't around for long enough to really produce any great games. I mean, if you think about another example of a system like this would be the NEC PCFX, which does not have many, if any, great games, but sort of a huge library of hentai stuff. And so throw all of those out. What kind of consoles does that leave us with? I think we're in the field of things like the 3DO. I would suggest the Jaguar, the Virtual Boy, not Virtua Boy. And, again, it's not a battle between those consoles, but I think those are that's how you would determine the best failed console. The PC Engines and Sega CD and Sega Saturns were not, they were not true failures because they had success somewhere. Put the Master System in there because of its success in Europe and Brazil. The other ones had such little market penetration and so little developer support that, they are spectacular failures without any kind of spectacular games. So I just had a slip of the tongue. The Sega CD would, I think, fit in that middle ground. The Sega 32X would fit in that middle ground. Sadly, I think the Vita is fitting in that middle ground. So what is the best? And that's just a matter of opinion. I would say, and I'm missing out on some, certainly. I think the Atari Lynx, again, would sort of fill that little gap between the two extremes. And for me, I would actually say it's the Sega CD, for me personally. It's the Sega CD because I think if you look at what the Sega CD, if you look at the original press around the Sega CD, it really was an impressive piece of technology. When you heard that there was going to be a second processor in it, of course, they mentioned what the processor was. As a kid, you're a second processor. You're going to double the power of the Genesis. It's going to blow the Super Nintendo away and stuff like that. That's what you thought. You didn't realize it was just another, whatever that was, Motorola 6800 or whatever that chip was. So, having gotten that, not right at launch, maybe 6-7 months after, you had the... actually, someone's going to call me out. It may not have been 7 months after because I had the top-loading one. So whenever that came out, that's when I got it. So maybe that was a little bit later. But anyway, you had this idea that it was going to be amazing, and what you got were Genesis games with better sound, for the most part. Yes, Sonic CD had the, had that sort of... whatever you want to call it, Super Nintendo style, Mode 7 effect to it. There were some other really good-looking games like Final Fight, which is my favorite game on the system, and also, incidentally, serves as the intro to this podcast, that one of the tracks from that game, the Industrial Zone track. But, it just didn't deliver in the way that you thought it would. Plus, you added the FMV games, which, again, seemed wonderful, from the hype perspective, where you said to yourself, oh my goodness, this is, the future. I'm going to play a movie, and then you play the movie and you realize that it fucking sucked, okay? So, that didn't do it for me, and I kind of neglected the system. Once I got through Sonic CD and Final Fight, I played a handful of games beyond that, rented the JRPGs. There was the Mickey Mania game, which I thought really looked impressive, but kind of dropped the system. But looking back, of those middle ground systems, obviously you had things like Snatcher. You had the great JRPGs that appeared on their Lunar series in particular, things like Popful Mail. And you had Sonic CD, which is one of my favorite games of all time. It was solid. There was enough substance there to kind of tide you over. If I, had all of those games, if I owned all of those games, I think once I got over my initial prejudice, I would have been... it was Shining Force, or there was a Shining something game. I don't know if it was Shining Force 3, but there was a Shining Force game on there. And very, very good. I would have been happy with that. So I look at the other games or the other systems that I put in that category. I mean, 32X did nothing for me. I didn't own it. I had a friend who had it. Those games, to me, were terrible for the most part, save for things like Knuckles Chaotix. The Lynx, I know there are some rabid Lynx fans out there, but I don't know that you had, and someone can name something for me, but those games were not of, the quality standards of the Game Gear and the Game Boy, at least from a design and mechanics standpoint. Virtual Boy, which I did have, and which I was really excited about, not enough good games on there to justify the full price purchase, and I think it was $180 when it came out. Actually, my favorite Virtual Boy game, I really only think there was one truly good one, and that was Wario Land. There's some other fun ones like the Pac-In Tennis game and the other Mario game, which was like old school Mario Brothers, but in 3D. Red Alarm had its charm for the time, things like that. So, not enough games there. 3DO and Jaguar, again, had a handful, but not enough. I think for the breadth of games and the breadth of quality games, you would have to go with, I think, the Sega CD. Now, I may be missing out on something. If we include the Vita in there, changes the discussion, because there are some very, very good Vita games that have come out. But, again, I'll pose this to the listening audience. What are some, based on that criteria that I've set out, and do you agree with that criteria, I guess would be question one, but based on that, what might be the best failed system? Now, if we're going to allow the Saturn and the TurboGrafx, if we're going to say, well, it has to be a market failure in North America, then I would lean heavily towards the TurboGrafx PC Engine. But again, I don't think that can truly be considered a failure. Alright, so we're just about to bring this inaugural episode of the Critical Strike podcast to an end. I just wanted to come out and just say to people who have been following me for a while, why am I doing this podcast? Basically, I have come to the conclusion, and if you listen to this, let me know what your opinion is. I find that a lot of the videos that I've been doing have been essentially like podcast segments. So I figured, why not actually try a podcast? It's kind of the one aspect of the retro media production scene that I have not engaged in. Obviously, I have the YouTube channel. I had the the actual journal. Did the live streaming stuff, and nothing has really stuck. So I figured, since I do, do those kind of commentary videos that perhaps a podcast is better suited to that sort of segment than necessarily a YouTube video. So, it's not like I'm leaving YouTube or anything like that. I'm going to keep YouTube there for the parodies, the game reviews, stuff like that. For, if there's some sort of hot breaking topic like my rant on Street Fighter V or something, that'll go up on the channel. But, just as I, collect stories and kind of think about the broader industry and piece together some, retro ideas and commentary, I think I am going to, attempt, at least for the next couple of months, to keep that, in podcast form and try to distribute this as widely as possible. This is my first attempt at a podcast, so, it may be a complete flop, but it's fun. It was fun to do. So, yeah. So if you've been a long time follower of Game Escape, and then there, for you guys out there who, comment on the videos, and we have some good discussions on YouTube, that, of course, is not going to end. But I'm just going to keep the commentary in this format, and of course, I would like to do a question and answer session eventually. So, you can tweet your questions to me. Should be linked up there in the SoundCloud description. If not, it's at GameEscape, at Game_Escape. I believe there's underscore after escape. You can just look that up. YouTube channel, W. Cladley. And thanks for listening to the Critical Strike podcast for the month of April, but of course covering a lot of the news from March of 2016.